Hello, BookTube. I'm Jonathan, and a common question I get is, don't you get bored only reading science fiction? And the answer to that is no, because A, I just really like science fiction, and B, there are so many different subgenres within science fiction that the reading experience that I get from, say, an epic space opera versus a drug-fueled cyberpunk novel or a bleak post-apocalyptic story is just so different. I'm getting different types of enjoyment, whether it's emotional or intellectual. And so it almost feels like I read a ton of different genres. So, anyway, today what I'm going to be doing is talking about these subgenres that I love and picking between my favorite children. So, I have narrowed it down to 12 subgenres within sci fi. There are obviously more than that, but if you just go on and on and on, it starts to get a little bit too niche, and I felt like the sample size was a little bit too small. So I've picked ones that I think you guys will be familiar with and ones that I have read a decent amount of. So something like maybe romantic sci-fi or horror sci-fi, which I think would be totally valid picks, are just not things that I've really read a lot of, whereas most of these I have read at least 10 books from, or many more than that. And in order to compare these 12 subgenres, what I did was I took every rating that I have given and found out the average rating for each of these 12 subgenres. So I don't have a recording of every single book I've ever written, but I do have a rating recorded for every book that I've read since starting the channel. So we've got about 4 or 5 years of history to go off, around 250 books. So a decent number, I think, in order to try and base these ratings off of. So I put together a quick little graph for you, and here's how it turned out. Okay, so here are 12 different subgenres within sci-fi ranked by my average rating out of 10 that I gave to all of the books that I read within these subgenres. And I'm going to go through all of these one by one and sort of break down why I think the average ended up where it did, and maybe make some arguments for and against its placing. Maybe whether I think it deserves to be at the top or bottom based on the rating, or maybe why I might disagree a little bit with the rating, what maybe were some of the determining factors in coming up with that average, and why I myself, if I could tinker with it a little, I would bump it up or down on my final list. And just before we get into the individual subgenres, I want to mention two things about this list. First, you'll notice that they're all pretty close. There's a lot of them kind of in that mid to high 7 range. So we are going to be splitting hairs. I like a lot of these genres a similar amount, but I'm going to do my best to separate them for you. And secondly, some of these genres do overlap. So something like First Contact and space opera could exist within the same novel. You could have a philosophical dystopian novel, something like that. So I just did my best to pick what is the one that represents this book the best. If you said, Jonathan, here is the road, gun to your head, what subgenre would you put the road in? And I'm like, post-apocalyptic. Okay, so yes, it does make it a little hard to separate them, but I just did my best to pick the one that I thought best represented the book. So let's get into them. We're going to start at the bottom and work our way up with our first subgenre category, science fantasy. So kicking things off with the stats, science fantasy ended up with a 6.96 average rating. I read 13 science fantasy books, and my favorite book within science fantasy was The Dark Tower by Stephen King. So kicking things off, I think this rating sort of makes sense. Unfortunately, it's the only one with an average less than 7, and I think the reason for that is I'm a sci-fi guy. I like sci-fi, don't really read fantasy. I watch fantasy, TV and movies, but don't really read a lot of fantasy. So it makes sense if we kind of combine those two, why it might be a little bit lower on the list for me, because it might have some less of the things that I'm often looking for and the type of things that I enjoy when I go to science fiction. But I don't think that necessarily means I'm not going to enjoy it, because I think, as with all of the subgenres, the biggest factor in terms of my enjoyment is the execution. There might be particular things that sound interesting to me and that I'm drawn to, but at the end of the day, how the author pulls it off, I think, is the most important factor in my ratings. So this isn't a huge surprise. I probably would have, if I did this blindly without looking at my ratings, science fantasy would be lower. But to defend science fantasy a little bit, I think some caveats are some science fantasy that I do like Hyperion and Sun Eater. I think I put in the space opera category. So depending on how I assigned the books, I think this score could have been bumped up a little bit. But at the end of the day, it makes sense for me. Sci-fi is the best fi. Moving on to our next subgenre of post-apocalyptic books, I had an average rating of 7.46. I read 13 post-apocalyptic books, and my favorite was Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. So this is another one that wasn't completely a surprise to me. I do like post-apocalyptic stories, but a criticism that I've said about them in the past is that they can feel a little bit similar. Something happens to cause an apocalypse, like a virus or the zombies or nuclear warfare, and the story follows these kind of survivors that band together to try and survive in these barren wastelands, and the moral of the story usually ends up being that wasn't really the zombies that were the monsters, we were the monsters. And so I'm being half facetious when I say that, because obviously there is variety within the genre and there's more to it than that, and I do like a lot of them, but I feel like some of them can be a little bit repetitive, so I think maybe the ones that are on the lower end of the score may be dragged down the average a little bit, just because to me they felt a bit generic. So the score makes sense to me here, but there are some that I really like. The Road by Cormac McCarthy, Station 11, so this is definitely a genre that I'll come back to from time to time. It's just not my go-to. And up next, we had space opera with a 7.72 average rating and 65 books read, which is actually my most read subgenre in today's video. And my favorite space opera is House of Suns by Alistair Reynolds. This was a shocker. I expected space opera to rank much higher than this, so let's try and figure out what happened here. Well, I think it makes sense that I've read a lot of space opera because I enjoy it. And I think the genre is quite broad. Really, any sort of like space adventures you could categorize as space opera. And I think it's a popular genre in general. A lot of authors are writing it. It sells a lot, so it makes sense from that perspective. And also, they often come in a series. So if I were to just combine something like The Expanse and Sun Eater, that's 16 novels right there. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why I've read a lot of space opera books, other than just I like them. Now, the rating did surprise me, because some of my favorite writers, like Alistair Reynolds, I would have thought would have brought the average up. But my theory is, because I've read so many, I've sort of expanded into some maybe lesser known authors, which sometimes are great. It's awesome when you find a hidden gem, but sometimes that can be a little bit hit or miss, and some of those books could maybe bring the average down just a little. And also, because as I mentioned, they often come in a series, it's hard for every single book in a series to be a banger. Like, I really like The Expanse, which I put in the space opera category, but there's a couple of books in there which were kind of misses for me, like 3 stars. So a bit of a surprise, but I think there's maybe some logic to why the space opera subgenre ended up with the average rating that it did. And we'll come back to this later and see if maybe I bump it up later on when I do my final verdict. All right, and then we had First Contact with an average rating of 7.75, 20 books read, and my favorite being Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. So this had a rather similar rating to space opera, which kind of makes sense. They are somewhat overlapping subgenres, and some of the things that I like about it, the perhaps space exploration, a mission, an adventure to go check out an alien signal or an alien spaceship, something like that, is something exciting. It does usually intrigue me when I hear a premise like that, and I do think some First Contact stories do end up being a little bit similar, but it's a big universe. I think the ways in which we can experience communication with aliens, how the aliens sort of exist or look or talk or communicate, what their motivations are, are really only limited by the imagination of the author. So this is definitely a subgenre that I'm a fan of, and yeah, surprised it's a little low, but we got some stiff competition coming up. After that, we had military sci-fi with an average rating of 7.81, only 8 books read, which is actually the lowest number in this list, and my favorite military sci-fi book is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. So I do like military sci-fi, another one which has a bit of overlap with space opera. For example, you could say that The Expanse is military sci-fi, although I ended up putting that in the space opera category. So there are things that I like about it. I like the space exploration. I like the dynamic between the characters on the ships or the various planets that we're visiting. But I think military sci-fi focuses on the battles, the tactics, the strategy, which is something that I can enjoy, especially when it's done well, but isn't necessarily what draws me to science fiction. I usually like the concepts, the ideas, the themes, and so I wouldn't have thought to put this one super high, and that's probably why I've only read 8 books from this subgenre. But it's one that I want to keep going with. I've read obviously a lot of the famous ones like the Forever War, Starship Troopers, and Ender's Game, which is my favorite. But I'm going to keep going. So let me know if you have any recommendations for the type of military sci-fi that you think I will enjoy. Moving on, we have philosophical sci-fi with an average rating of 7.86. 43 books read, with my favorite being Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So I think I maybe could have just called this one soft sci-fi, as I kind of combined philosophical with psychological. So, anything sort of like Philip K. Dick or Ursula K. Le Guin, they ended up in this category. And so this is the second most read. This is the second highest number of books read within a subgenre after space opera. So one that I definitely think that I enjoy, but it can be a little bit hit or miss because I am someone that is drawn to ideas. And the best philosophical books obviously have interesting and intriguing ideas, but sometimes it's a little too nebulous, airy-fairy, sort of like character-driven, borderline fantasy. Not always my favorite, but I think the ones that hit really hit. They're the ones that you make an emotional connection with. You say, yes, this was thought-provoking or stimulating, or I resonated with this one. Something like Frankenstein, a book that I think about pretty regularly. So yeah, I don't know if I would have predicted this to be my number one, but I would have predicted it to be fairly high on my list. And then we had hard sci-fi with an average rating of 7.87, 19 books read, with my favorite being Permutation City by Greg Egan. So with hard sci-fi, it was a little bit tricky to decide what to put where. For example, I think Alistair Reynolds is a hard sci-fi writer. I'd maybe put him at about a 7 out of 10 on the hardness scale. But does that level of hardness supersede the fact that, say, something like Revelation Space is quite clearly also space opera? So I think for those kind of books, I ended up going with sort of the base genre like cyberpunk or space opera or whatever it was. Whereas a book like Permutation City, which is at like a 9, maybe even a 10 in terms of the hard sci-fi-ness, even though that book is cyberpunk, I think the hardness superseded the cyberpunk-ness of the book, so it ended up in this category. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. Anyway, I like hard sci-fi. Sometimes it goes over my head. If it's really hard, there's a lot of science, a lot of technical stuff that I didn't study at school. I try to follow along. I usually pick up a little bit here and there, but there are definitely some books which are perhaps a little bit too sciencey for me. But if I'm able to grasp at least a decent amount of the concepts, and that's packaged with an interesting story or idea or theme, then yeah, it's something I really like, especially because it's unique to science fiction. Because you might get something in fantasy that has great characters or themes, but you're just never going to get the equivalent of hard sci-fi in another genre. So something that makes science fiction unique and something that I love about science fiction. And something that I just remembered before we move on to the next one is that this was separated from philosophical sci-fi by an average of 0.01. So these are kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum. We have hard sci-fi and then philosophical sci-fi, which is, as I said, is kind of soft sci-fi. Very similar ratings. So it just kind of shows, even though I might have thought that I had preferences for one over the other, it ultimately comes down to execution. And it seems like, at least based on the sample size of books that I've picked and to read and thought I might enjoy reading, the execution turned out to be pretty even between the two. All right, up next is Cyberpunk with an average rating of 7.98, 20 books read, with my favorite being Vert by Jeff Noon. There were a couple in contention here. Permutation City, as I mentioned, also cyberpunk, but I put it in the hard category. And I also considered Hardwired, Altered Carbon, Neuromancer. But Vert, just such a wild and wacky book, I ended up picking it as my favorite here. So Cyberpunk, if you'd have asked me maybe a couple of years ago, I might have had it a little bit lower on my list because I'd had a bit of a hit and miss experience. Sometimes these books can be quite tricky to read, especially if they lean into that kind of hazy, trippy world building that just doesn't really hold your hand. I think as a newer sci-fi reader, maybe I didn't always find it that easy to get into. But cyberpunk is a genre that I've fallen more and more in love with over the years. Some of my favorite books that I've read recently have been cyberpunk. And so, yeah, I'm not surprised to sort of see it where it is. I do think it belongs, for me, towards the higher end of the list. Something that I appreciate about cyberpunk is that it has such a clearly defined aesthetic. If I were to mention the name of another subgenre, you might be able to come up with some imagery, maybe based on a book or a mix of books. But when I say cyberpunk, I bet a pretty clear vision comes through of a character with, cybernetic modifications, dark skies, neon lights in the background. It's kind of grungy. There's drugs, sex, violence, tech. It's a very specific kind of world, and I think it's kind of fun to play in a world where there's kind of like tropes that are understood by the reader. So you can kind of give them the tropes that they like, and then start to subvert that by doing unique and interesting things with your cyberpunk novel as well. And as we keep moving higher on the list, we have dystopian sci-fi with an average rating of 8.08, 12 books read, and my favorite being 1984 by George Orwell. So here's our first subgenre to break the 8 barrier when it comes to the average rating. And it makes sense to me because a lot of dystopian sci-fi that I've read is highly regarded. I think it deserves to be up there. One that I read not that recently, but recent-ish was We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, a big influence on 1984, Brave New Worlds, and yeah, highly influential and, got a good rating from me. I do enjoy these kinds of books. I'm not surprised to see it high, although it's the type of thing that I have to be in the mood for. I don't always feel like reading dystopian, so I think that it's something I want to keep reading more of, and I think that number will go up over time. And I think there may be some classics that I'd read before starting the channel, which contributes to that. So another one that I do enjoy. Let me know some of your favorite dystopian books that you think I might not have read yet. Moving into the top 3, we have Time Travel, with an average rating of 8.17, 12 books read, with my favorite being Time and Again by Clifford D. Simak. This is something I actually just read quite recently. For a while, my favorite was The End of Eternity by Isaac Asimov, but Simak recently stole that spot with Time and Again. So time travel is a subgenre that I really enjoy, although sometimes time travel can be used as a trope in a book that is part of another subgenre as opposed to necessarily the time travel element being the focus of the entire story itself. So that's maybe why this number was a little bit lower than I expected, because I do like time travel. And I am actually planning on making a time travel list later in the year. And there's a couple of big time travel books that I have purchased recently and plan to read, so I can contribute to that list, tick them off my TBR, and maybe we'll see what happens to that average rating, whether it'll go up or down, because the sample size is a little bit low at the moment. But my gut feeling is that time travel deserves to be pretty high, because I do like the different ways, the different rules of time travel. I don't have strict opinions on what the best form of time travel is, just as long as you set up rules in your book and then you stick to those rules. Okay, if you present something that's at least logically possibly believable, I'll go with you. Just make sure you stick to the rules that you've set up, and I'll stay with you. And then with my second highest average rating, we have satirical sci-fi, with an average rating of 8.20, 12 books read, and my favorite being Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. So I didn't expect this one to be as high, but when I think about it, it kind of makes sense, because I haven't read a ton of satirical science fiction, and this does include Kurt Vonnegut and Douglas Adams, so the average rating is probably going to be pretty good. I think this is something that I'm not necessarily always looking for. I think I usually enjoy comedy in other mediums, whether that's film or TV. That's usually sort of where I'm going to if I'm in a comedic mood, not necessarily sci-fi. I'm usually reading sci-fi for the concepts and the ideas, the epic scale and scope that you can get in science fiction. But if there's good satire in there as well, I'll definitely be on board. So I'm not sure how to feel about this one. I feel like it might be benefiting a little bit from the small sample size. But then again, it also has some of my favorite authors, so I shouldn't be too surprised. And then finally, the subgenre with the highest average rating, we have Technothriller, with an average rating of 8.30, 12 books read, my favorite being Demon by Daniel Suarez. I once called it Damon, got corrected that it was actually Demon, started pronouncing it as Demon, and now I get comments telling me it's Damon. I'm pretty sure it's Demon. Anyway, the Technothriller. This was a surprise. I wouldn't have picked this to be at the top of my list, but I went through the books and this is in large part made up of Daniel Suarez, Michael Crichton, Blake Crouch. So it kind of makes sense that the average rating would be quite high because I am a fan of those authors. But again, I think this is another one that might be benefiting from the small sample size. If I kept reading more and more techno-thrillers, I'm sure it would keep a pretty good rating, but would it maintain the #1 spot? I'm not sure. Let me know your favorite techno-thriller book to try and keep that average rating of mine high. So we've taken a look at all the numbers, but what is my final verdict? Am I going to override the stats and pick different subgenres to be at the top of my list? Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick my top 5. If I could only read 5 science fiction subgenres for the rest of my life, here are the 5 that I would pick. I would choose hard sci-fi, space opera, philosophical sci-fi, cyberpunk, and dystopian. I picked these 5 because I think they represent what I enjoy in science fiction, the big ideas, the concepts, the scale and the scope, just really all the things that are going to stimulate me on both an intellectual and an emotional level. And I think these are all very different in style. If I could only read these 5, I still don't think I would get bored because a dystopian book is very different from a space opera. Cyberpunk is different from, maybe a philosophical sci-fi book like Frankenstein or something like that. So that is my top 5. And then I'll go through the other subgenres just to explain why I didn't include them, maybe try and game the system a bit by kind of sliding them into my top 5. For example, science fantasy, I think I could get some of that in space opera through something like Dune or Hyperion. Then post-apocalyptic, that's often kind of considered under the dystopian label at times. So I think I could sneak some post-apocalyptic books in there as well. First Contact and military sci-fi, I think you could also package with space opera, so I could kind of cheat the system that way. When it comes to time travel, that could apply to really any subgenre if you think of it as more of a trope than a subgenre itself, even though some books are definitely time travel books, like that is the main focus in terms of the story and the themes. And then we also have techno-thriller, which I think could sometimes be hard sci-fi or cyberpunk, so we could sneak some in that way. And satirical sci-fi, I think, often overlaps with philosophical sci-fi. So as much as it hurts me to not include the subgenre that I associated with Kurt Vonnegut, my favorite writer, I'm going to find a way to get some Vonnegut, all right? Some philosophical sci-fi by Kurt Vonnegut will still be read by me. So there you go. Those are my top 5. Those are my reasonings. Obviously, it's a bit subjective. There's overlap between these subgenres. And, what you look for in reading and science fiction might be different from what I am looking to experience when I pick up science fiction. So let me know your top 5 subgenres in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well as your recommendations for some of your favorites. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima, A New Eden, Half Ogre, Zakawe, Samil, Colin, and the above average Bamsis. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.